Hello again everybody, and welcome back to another album ranking. I'm very excited for this one because today we're of course going to be talking about Megadeth, which is probably my favourite band ever, and I've got quite a lot to say about a few of these albums, so let's head on into it. So coming in at dead last place we have an awful album, Super Collider. With some of these lyrics and riffs like in the title track, it makes me feel like I'm listening to a Shane Dawson song, and that's not an exaggeration. The only good songs is like Cold Sweat and Dance in the Rain, I guess, are okay. But then there's a handful of absolutely awful, inexcusable songs like Off the Edge and Forget to Remember. And then there's the title track, Super Collider, which I already poked fun at, but genuinely it is probably the worst Megadeth song I've ever heard. Coming in next we have another stinker, which is The World Needs a Hero. There's a couple more good songs in this album than the previous one, like there's Motorpsycho, which is okay. Dread and the Fugitive Mind is good enough, I guess, although it's kind of just a bit derivative of Sweating Bullets, and it's also not as good, but hey, it has a cool guitar solo, so that's something. Return to Hangar is pretty interesting because it borrows lyrics from Hangar 18, but then there are of course a fair share of stinkers in this album. There's Disconnect, which is awful. Burning Bridges is pretty bad. Losing My Senses isn't great. It's a pretty bad album, but it's not quite as offensively terrible as Super Collider. So, yeah. Alright, next up we have United Abominations, or as I thought it was called when I first read the name, Untitled Abortions. So I'm just gonna call this album Untitled Abortions from now. Yes, the album that is aged like fine milk. I don't know why, but this album just feels really dated to me. Maybe it's just because of that garbage music video for Never Walk Alone, which is actually a pretty good song, but like, I mean, come on. I didn't actually think we can get a music video with worse digital effects than Sweating Bullets, one that came out a decade before this. But whatever. It also doesn't help that the album cover looks like a dated PS1 game, but whatever, I guess. Yeah, this album feels very repetitive with not a lot of variety here. Most of these songs are fairly catchy and inoffensive, like Gears of War, but then again, they also feel pretty bland. I guess there's also You're Dead and Americastan, or however that song is pronounced. Like, the songs are pretty catchy, but when you listen to the whole album, it just kind of feels bland. Okay, so up next is a slightly more popular Megadeth album, Cryptic Warnings. Now, I don't know if this is trying to be a prog metal album or what. Like, if it's trying to be And Justice for All, but with shorter songs, then I gotta say it's failing badly. I mean, it's a fine enough album, there's nothing really that wrong with it on paper. It's just kind of boring. And when you look at the fact that the songs are actually pretty short, that's not a good thing. There's quite a good few songs in here, like there's Mastermind, which I really like, and FFF. But then there's also a lot of songs like Secret Place, Use This Man, and She-Wolf, which are just kind of boring. And I really don't have much to say about this album. I feel like it has a bit more personality than a lot of the later albums, but I mean, it's not exactly bursting with personality, so yeah. Okay, up next we have a much more recent album, Dystopia. I can't say I really like how they've decided to modernize it, but I mean, hey, I've seen worse, like with Slipknot and Metallica, so I can't complain too much. I like songs like Death from Within and Post-American World, but I can't say I really like songs like Lying in State or The Threat is Real. There's no songs that I can say I absolutely hate, but there's also no songs I can say I absolutely love. So yeah, it's fine. It's yet another inoffensive yet bland album. Endgame is weird. It's kind of a hit or miss album, I would say. It honestly opens pretty bad with Dialectic Chaos and This Day We Fight. 44 Minutes is really good. I would say it's definitely the best song in the album. I mean, it's not a masterpiece, but it's pretty good. I also like the song The Hardest Part Is Letting Go, Sealed with a Kiss, which is a very long song title. And then there's songs like Bodies, which is pretty bad, and when I saw it, I got excited because part of me thought it might have been like a Drowning Pool cover or something, but no. How the Story Ends has some pretty good riffs in there, but it's not really a very strong album, riff and solo-wise, so yeah. Now, with Risk, I think this is where the albums start to get a lot better. Risk is a pretty good album, a little hit or miss here and there, but overall I think it's very solid. The opening track, Insomnia, is a little weak, but then it picks itself back up really quickly with track 2, Prince of Darkness. I think Crush 'Em and Ecstasy are like the best songs in the album. and they kind of remind me of like something out of Euthanasia, which is coming up later, which is a really good album. I'd say this album is like a little bit similar to Cryptic Warnings, which came before this, but a lot better. It's not the most thrashy album in the world, it's much more hard rock, but I think it works pretty well with this album. Alright, next up we got 13, which is definitely one of the better modern Megadeth albums. We the People is really, really good. Public Enemy #1 is a banger, and then there's Fast Lane and Deadly Nightshade with some really good riffs in there. One or two of the songs aren't very good, like Guns, Drugs and Money, but that's to be expected, so you know. What I like about this album is that it definitely has a strong aesthetic to it, which is honestly more than I can say about a lot of modern Megadeth albums. So yeah, I like this one. Good job. The Sick, the Dying and the Dead is the most recent Megadeth album, came out last year, and I gotta say, I'm really pleasantly surprised by this. I mean, it's 1,000 times better than Metallica's 72 Seasons, if that says anything. It opens really, really nice with the title track. There's Dogs of Chernobyl, which is a fucking great song. And then Police Truck, which is possibly my favorite in the album. Again, one or two kind of generic songs like Life and Hell, but it's not really that big of a deal. One thing I will say I was very pleasantly surprised with in this album is Dave Mustaine's vocals. Now, in this album, it's kind of the first time you can really hear his age, but weirdly enough, it sounds really good, I think. Like, it kind of sounds like Dave Mustaine doing a pretty bad impression of Lemmy from Motorhead, but honestly, it worked really well for me. I realized while editing that I just completely forgot to add in The System Has Failed, yeah, it goes here. It's a pretty good album. Big fan of Mice and Men and Kick the Chair. Okay, so this next one is 100% gonna surprise a lot of you. Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good, which was the debut album from Megadeth. Now, people tend to really like this album, but it's not really talked about as being up there with like Peace Sells or Rust in Peace. I don't think it's really that great. I mean, I think it's good, that's why I'm ranking it pretty high. But at the same time, for a debut album of my favorite band ever, I've got one or two problems with it. Problem number one, I don't think Dave Mustaine's vocals are very good in this. They weren't bad, but I think by the second album, Peace Sells, I think that's when they were perfected. I also just think, riff-wise, this album isn't that strong. I think they struck gold with the title track Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good, which is a really good song with a real neat riff at the start. But then again, you also have songs like Rattlehead, which is kind of not that great because there's not a lot of variety in the song. There's a bit of a trend in this album with really good riffs at the start of the song, but they're not really keeping up that quality throughout the entirety of the song, if that makes any sense, like with Rattlehead. I really like the song Mechanics, which is just Metallica's Four Horsemen, but with different lyrics, because if you weren't aware, somehow, Dave Mustaine wrote like the entirety of Kill 'Em All. That's why Kill 'Em All is so good. And before Kill 'Em All was released, Dave Mustaine was kicked out of Metallica, and they stole all of his riffs. So essentially, Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good was basically just a big fuck you to Metallica. Which, fair enough. They did steal all of his songs, essentially, so yeah. However, I'm gonna confess to my sins here and say that I think Kill 'Em All is better than Killing Is My Business, which is kind of a sin to say as a Megadeth fan, but whatever, at this point, I don't really care. Alright, next up we got So Far So Good So What, which a lot of people are going to be surprised I ranked it this high, because people don't tend to like this album all that much. I think it's because originally the sound quality mixing was really, really bad, but I'm going off the remastered edition from 2004, and I think this is a really good album if you actually listen to the remastered version. I mean, come on, there's a Sex Pistols cover in this with Anarchy in the UK, and I think it's better than the original. I think Set the World Afire and In My Darkest Hour are like some of the best Megadeth songs. I think this album just has such a great aesthetic to it and such an iconic album cover. And honestly, if you listen to the remastered version, those vocals are really, really good. Okay, coming up next is Euthanasia. This is probably the most dad rock of all the albums, if that makes any sense to anyone. Especially with songs like The Train of Consequences, which... it's definitely not as heavily riff-based as some of the more thrashy albums. It's a lot more groovy and hard rock. But I don't think that's a problem with this album. I think the only songs that really suffer from this is like Elysian Fields. I hope I pronounced that right. But I think most of these songs are just bangers. Like Addicted to Chaos, Family Tree, I Thought I Knew It All, and A Tout Le Monde. I also hope I pronounced that one right. Alright, now we're finally at the top 3. And these are the 3 albums that pretty much everyone who knows Megadeth knows these albums. So let's get these out of the way. Countdown to Extinction. or as I thought this used to be called, Countdown to Execution, which I think is a cooler name, but whatever. This album is pretty iconic for giving songs like Sweating Bullets and Symphony of Destruction, the latter being probably the most famous Megadeth song, with a really neat riff in there. I'd say this is the first album where they started to go less thrashy, which isn't really a problem for me necessarily, but it kind of is to a few people, so yeah. I say this album almost gears to more towards like old heavy metal. But yeah, there's also some really good other songs in here, like the title track and Skin of My Teeth. Sweating Bullets might be the most recognizable Megadeth song. Alright, so number 2, and by the way, if you know Megadeth, then these last two, you know exactly what order these are going to be in, because there's only one that's going to be in number 1 spot, so let's just get this one out of the way. Peace Sells by Who's Buying. Can I just say that the title track, Peace Sells, is my favorite song of all time. There's no question about that. The most clean bass riff you'll ever hear. The chugging and the palm muting of the opening riff is just so fun to play, and also so fun to hear, might I add. And then halfway through when you got Can You Put a Price on Peace, and then everything after that is just, oh, it's so good. Oh, by the way, there are other songs in this album. Devil's Island, that's fucking amazing. The Conjuring, Wake Up Dead, Bad Omen, and My Last Words. Like, come on, man. It's just such a good album. And to top it off, it's got like the best album cover in thrash history. So, I mean, what more could you even want? Okay, and finally, I feel like I don't even need to explain this one. Number 1 is Rust in Peace. Do I even need to say anything else? I mean, you got the opening with Holy War's The Punishment Due, which is the best opening riff to any album in history ever. I'm pretty sure this has the best vocals in any album I've ever heard ever. Tornado of Souls is one of the best songs ever recorded, with the best guitar solo ever recorded. The entirety of Hangar 18 and Techno Prisoners makes me want to cream. Dawn Patrol, which is a very short track, but then you've got the iconic bass line. Rust in Peace Polaris, which the vocals in that. And then there's Five Magics, which is... I mean, there is truly no bad songs in it. There is truly no okay-ish songs in this album. This is one of the best albums in history ever. So anyway, I'm gonna stop before I get too excited. So, you know, feel free to let me know what other bands you want to see me rank. And, yeah, goodbye.